The 360-year-old American, the man who outlived, Time, Part 1, The Birth of a Legend, 1665 to 1776. Jonathan Brightwell's Origins and Discovery of His Strange Gift, Chapter 1, The Boy from Massachusetts Bay. Childhood in Shadows. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a place of piety and fear, a land caught between the promise of a new world and the suffocating grip of the old one. The year was 1671, and the village of Newbury was a cluster of wooden homes clustered around a gray, endless wilderness. It was here that Jonathan Brightwell was born, and it was here that he first understood the passage of time, not as a steady river, but as a tide, shifting, unrelenting, and indifferent to the lives it carried away. He was 6 years old when he first realized he did not belong. The cold bit harder that winter than it ever had before. The frost sank deep into the timbers of their house, creeping through the cracks like an unseen hand. Jonathan lay awake in the loft, listening to the sounds of his father's breath below. Slow, heavy, exhausted. His mother's voice was soft in prayer, barely more than a whisper. He did not understand the words, but he understood the weight behind them. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The world beyond their hearth was vast and unforgiving, and he was only beginning to understand its cruelty. His father was a strict man, hardened by the sea, his hands calloused from the years spent shaping wood and stone. His mother was kind, though there was always a nervousness in her eyes, as if she feared she had brought a child into a world that would never be safe. Jonathan's siblings had died young, one from fever, another from hunger. He was the last, the one who survived. "God has a plan for you," his mother told him once, brushing his dark hair back from his forehead. "He would not have let you live otherwise." But Jonathan did not feel blessed. He felt different. And in Newbury, different was dangerous. A world of watchful eyes. By the time Jonathan was 9, he had learned the rules of survival. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not question the elders. Do not stare too long at anything unnatural. Do not show fear in the face of sermons that spoke of fire and damnation.
And most importantly, do not draw attention to yourself.
He saw what happened to those who did. There was a girl named Abigail, 3 years older than him, with hair the color of wheat in summer, and a voice that carried through the village like birdsong. She was the daughter of a midwife, and though she was kind, she did not know when to stay silent. She spoke too much, laughed too freely, and the elders whispered that she was touched by darkness. One evening, she vanished. Jonathan never saw her again. "They took her," his mother said, her voice barely above a breath. His father only grunted in response. Jonathan wanted to ask who they were, but some questions were not meant to be answered. The moment he knew. The first time Jonathan understood the weight of time, he was alone in the woods. His father had sent him to gather firewood before dusk, warning him not to stray too far from the path. But curiosity had always been his downfall. He wandered deeper than he should have, following the whisper of the wind through the trees, the faint glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the frozen ground. That was when he saw it. A fox, lean and starving, caught in the jaws of a steel trap. It did not move as he approached. Its eyes were bright with pain, but there was something else, something ancient, something that saw him. Jonathan felt the weight of it, as if the creature knew something he did not. As if it understood that life and death were not what he thought them to be. The fox should have been dead, but it was not. It was suffering, caught between two fates, waiting for an end that would not come. Jonathan knelt beside it, his breath clouding in the cold air. He wanted to help, but he did not know how. He reached out, fingers trembling, and then a voice behind him. "What are you doing?" He spun around. His father stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes dark with something unreadable. "Come away," his father ordered. "It's not your place to decide." Jonathan hesitated. The fox let out a low, rasping sound, and for a moment he thought he understood it. He thought he could feel what it felt. Pain, time stretching endlessly, an eternity of suffering in a moment. His father stepped forward and, without hesitation, brought his axe down. It was over. Jonathan did not move as the blood spread across the snow. He did not cry. He only watched. His father studied him for a long moment before placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "There are things in this world we do not question," he said. things that are meant to be. Jonathan nodded, but in that moment, something inside him changed. He felt something he could not explain, as if time had slowed around him, as if he had stepped outside of it. He knew then that he would never forget this moment, that it would live inside him, unchanging, long after his father and mother were gone. It was the first time he had sensed it, the strange stillness inside him, the feeling that time did not move for him the way it did for others. The beginning of the end. By the time he was 12, Jonathan had stopped aging. It was subtle at first. Children grew faster in those days. Hard labor and hard winters shaped them into men and women before their time. But Jonathan did not change. His limbs remained lean while others thickened with muscle. His face, while no longer a child's, did not shift the way his peers did. His father noticed first, then his mother, then the village. Whispers began to follow him, soft at first, then sharp like a blade. It was his mother who saved him. The night before his 13th birthday, she woke him in silence, her face pale in the dim candlelight. "You must leave," she whispered. "Tonight." He did not ask why. He already knew. She pressed a small satchel into his hands. "Go south. Stay away from towns. Do not let them see you." Jonathan hesitated. His father was nowhere to be seen. She cupped his face, her hands warm despite the cold. "You are different, my son, and they will not understand. They will fear you." He swallowed the lump in his throat. His mother smiled, a sad breaking thing. "Run, my love, before it's too late." So he did. He ran into the night, into the unknown, and for the first time in his life, Jonathan Brightwell was truly alone. It was the beginning of a journey that would never end. Chapter 2. The Alchemist's Apprentice. A meeting in the shadows. Jonathan wandered the wilderness for weeks, his hunger gnawing at him like an iron jaw. The forests of Massachusetts stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of gnarled oaks and frozen streams. At night, he listened to the wolves in the distance, their howls drifting across the barren land like ghosts. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, a satchel of dried bread his mother had given him, and the growing weight of his own isolation. He had always known he was different. Now he feared he was alone in that difference. By the time he stumbled into the small settlement of Ipswich, he was nearly starved. His feet were blistered, his body weak, but it was the weight in his chest, the loss of his mother, the knowledge that he could never return, that truly made him hollow. He stole what food he could from market stalls, darting between wooden carts like a shadow. He kept to the alleys, avoiding the sharp gazes of Puritan townsfolk. He knew the danger of being caught, of being recognized. It was in one of these alleys that he met the man who would change everything, the old man in the candlelight. The shop was unremarkable from the outside, nestled between a blacksmith's forge and a weaver's cottage. The wooden sign above the door had no name, only the faded imprint of a symbol, a serpent coiled around a staff. Jonathan had been watching the shop for days, drawn to the strange odors of burnt herbs and minerals that drifted from its windows. He had seen few visitors enter, and those who did left quickly, their faces tight with unease. One night, as the streets fell silent and the lanterns flickered low, Jonathan slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of parchment, old wood, and something more pungent, something metallic like scorched iron. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with books whose spines bore no English words. Bottles of powders and tinctures glowed faintly under candlelight. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden counter, winding like veins beneath the dust. And then there was the old man. He sat at a great wooden desk, hunched over a sheet of parchment, scratching furiously with a quill. His beard was long, silver like frost, and his robes, deep maroon lined with gold, were unlike anything Jonathan had ever seen. He did not look up. "You should not be here." His voice was dry, brittle like aged parchment. Jonathan froze. He had not expected to be noticed so quickly. "I mean no harm," Jonathan said, his voice small. I was only looking." Now the old man raised his head, his eyes dark and sharp beneath heavy brows. He studied Jonathan for a long moment, as if measuring something unseen. "You are hungry?" Jonathan's throat tightened, but he nodded. The old man gestured to a plate on the desk. Bread, a wedge of cheese, a single apple. "Eat." Jonathan hesitated only a moment before taking the bread. He had stolen before, but this felt different. This was given freely, though he did not yet understand why. The old man watched him eat in silence. Only when Jonathan had finished did he speak again. "There is something unusual about you." Jonathan felt his stomach clench.
You move like someone untethered," the man interrupted.
Like one who is watching the world, rather than living within it. Jonathan swallowed hard. He did not understand how, but this man, this stranger, had already seen through him. The old man leaned forward. "Tell me, child, have you noticed that time does not touch you as it should?" Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He should have run. He should have denied everything, feigned ignorance, vanished into the night. But he was so tired. So very, very tired of running. And so he told the truth. The scholar's name. The old man listened without interruption as Jonathan described the things he had never spoken aloud. The way he had not grown in years. The way he had sensed time slowing when he watched his father kill the fox. The way he had felt, even as a boy, that something inside him was different. The old man nodded as if he had expected this. "My name is Elias Hawthorne," he said finally, "and you are not the first of your kind." Jonathan stiffened. "What do you mean?" Elias gestured around the room. "These books, these vials and powders, they are tools of an ancient pursuit. You would call it alchemy, but it is more than gold, more than base transmutation. It is the study of time itself." Jonathan frowned. He had heard of alchemists before, men who sought to turn lead into gold, who whispered of immortality and forbidden knowledge. The Puritan elders had called them deceivers, men of the devil. And yet, looking at Elias, Jonathan did not see a sorcerer. He saw something else. A seeker of truths. A man who had spent his life chasing something just out of reach. "I have been studying this for decades," Elias continued. "I have searched for signs of the eternal, for the ones who do not age." His gaze sharpened. "And now one has walked into my home." Jonathan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Do you know why you are this way?" Elias asked. Jonathan shook his head. Elias studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Then let us find out." The apprentice's first lesson. Elias did not send him away. Instead, he offered Jonathan a choice. Stay and learn, or leave and wander forever in ignorance. Jonathan had spent his whole life afraid of himself, afraid of the truth. But for the first time, he had a path forward. He stayed. In the weeks that followed, he became Elias Hawthorne's apprentice. He learned to read the symbols in the old books, to mix the herbs and salts into elixirs that smelled of earth and fire. He learned of the ancient philosophers, the seekers of the hidden arts, Paracelsus, Flamel, Avicenna. But most of all, he learned about himself. He was not the first to defy time. Others had existed before him, though their fates, Elias warned, were unknown. Jonathan listened. He learned. He obeyed. But deep down, he knew one thing. Whatever had made him this way, whatever force had bent time around him, was not finished with him yet. And someday he would have to face it. Chapter 3. The Night of the Eclipse, a doorway to the unknown. The air smelled of fire and iron, thick with the acrid bite of burning herbs. Shadows flickered against the walls of Elias Hawthorne's study, cast by the lone candle that burned low on the wooden desk. Outside, the sky churned, a heavy darkness creeping over the world as the moon swallowed the sun. It was an eclipse. Jonathan Brightwell had seen one before, years ago when he was only a boy, staring up at the sky in wonder. Then it had been something distant, something strange but natural. But now, under Elias's roof, it was something more, something powerful, something that felt like a door unlocking. The old ones believed that moments like these reveal truths hidden from men, Elias murmured, grinding something dark and brittle between his fingers. His voice was low, his words careful. They believe the world is not fixed, but shifting, and that if one listens, if one knows, one may glimpse what lies beyond. Jonathan sat across from him, his hands resting on the heavy book they had been studying. He wanted to ask if Elias himself believed this, but he had learned in the past weeks that the old man rarely answered such questions plainly. Instead, he would tilt his head, give a half smile, and say, "What do you believe, my boy?" And Jonathan did not know what he believed anymore. But tonight, he would find out. The elixir Elias worked with the precision of a man who had spent decades chasing the unseen. The brass mortar and pestle clinked softly as he ground the strange ingredients into dust, powdered amber, crushed foxglove, something darker, more metallic, perhaps hematite or something Jonathan did not recognize. The old man's movements were methodical. He poured a small amount of honey into the dark mixture, stirring carefully. Then came a splash of something clear, sharp-smelling, something Jonathan knew instinctively was not ordinary water. The liquid fizzed, hissed, as if resisting the alchemist's hand. "Is this safe?" Jonathan asked. Elias only smiled.
Safety is a matter of perspective. Jonathan swallowed.
He had learned much in the past months under Elias's guidance. He had read books older than America itself, books that spoke of strange men who lived beyond time, of elixirs that granted insight or madness. But until now, they had only been theory. He had never seen Elias attempt something like this. The sky outside darkened further. The light of the world dimmed as the moon took its place over the sun, turning day into shadow. A cold sensation prickled at the back of Jonathan's neck. Elias lifted the wooden cup that held the completed mixture and held it out. "Drink." Jonathan hesitated. He had been taught since childhood that magic was the work of the devil, that alchemy was nothing more than foolishness, or worse, heresy. But had the Puritans not also said that his own existence, his inability to age, was unnatural? If so, then he had already been marked by forces beyond his control. What harm could one sip do? Jonathan took the cup. The mixture was thick, like tar, but the scent was intoxicating, herbal, smoky, metallic. He hesitated only a moment longer before tipping the cup to his lips. The taste was overwhelming. Bitterness flooded his tongue, laced with something almost sweet beneath it, something ancient. The moment it touched his throat, he felt a sharp coldness spread through his chest, as if he had swallowed ice itself. His vision blurred. His pulse quickened. And then the world shattered. The vision. The study vanished. Jonathan found himself standing in an endless expanse of white. No sky, no earth, just emptiness. The air was thick, vibrating with something unseen, something humming just beyond the reach of hearing. He turned, but there was nothing to turn to, only himself, only his own breath. Was he dreaming? Had Elias poisoned him? No, this was something else. Then he saw them, figures emerging from the void. They were not quite men, not quite shadows. Shapes flickering like candle flames, shifting between forms, sometimes tall, sometimes impossibly thin. They moved without footsteps, their outlines blurred, their features indistinct. Jonathan tried to speak, but his voice did not exist here. One of the figures moved closer. And though it had no face, no mouth, Jonathan heard it. "You are not meant to be." The voice was not spoken. It was inside him, filling the space behind his eyes, curling in his bones. Jonathan stepped back. "Who? What are you?" "The ones who watch." The others remained still, their forms wavering, as if made of something that could not decide its own shape. Jonathan's breath came faster. "Where am I?" Tween. Something cold pressed against his back, and he turned sharply, only to find himself staring into something far worse. It was himself, or rather, something wearing his face. Jonathan saw his own eyes, but they were hollow, empty like the depths of a well. His own lips moved, but he did not speak. "You do not belong here." His heart slammed against his ribs. "What does that mean?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You have been unmade." The world around him cracked. A terrible sound filled the void, like the tearing of fabric, the screaming of something vast and unseen. The figures flickered, and for the first time, Jonathan felt it. A pull, something yanking him backward, dragging him from the space between, forcing him back into the world he had left behind. He barely had time to draw breath before the whiteness exploded. The return. Jonathan gasped, his body jerking violently as he slammed back into existence. His lungs burned. His skin was slick with sweat. He was on the floor of the study, his fingers curled into the wooden boards as if to anchor himself to reality. Elias knelt beside him, watching. Jonathan could not speak. "Tell me," Elias murmured. "What did you see?" Jonathan's throat was raw, his pulse still hammering. But one thought repeated in his mind, over and over, louder than all the rest. "You are not meant to be." Something had seen him. Something had recognized him. And it had known. His chest ached with the weight of it. He forced himself to meet Elias's eyes. "I think I saw something else." He swallowed hard. "Something watching." Elias's expression did not change. He only nodded. "I thought as much." Jonathan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Elias exhaled slowly, as if considering his words. "You are different, my boy. I have suspected it since the moment you walked through my door. But now... His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. Now I believe you are truly untethered. Jonathan shuddered.
He did not know what that meant.
But he knew one thing for certain.
Whatever had happened, whatever had seen him in that place, it had changed something.
And it was not finished with him yet.